Welcome everyone to the 6th of our ESG webinar series, The Age of Authenticity and ESG, Challenges and Opportunities of AI and FinTech. So firstly, a bit of housekeeping. Please can I ask all of the panelists to put themselves on mute when you're not speaking. And attendees, please can you use the Q&A function for any questions that you may have rather than using the chat function. For those of you who I don't know and haven't met before, I'm Emily Eyre. I'm Managing Director of BRUIN Financial. We launched our ESG series at the start of the year. We've been delighted with the positive feedback we've had, so much so that we've made a 5-part series into a 6-part series with the addition of our webinar today. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass over to Georgie, who has been instrumental in delivering the series so that she can introduce you to our panel. Over to you, Georgie.
Thanks very much, Emily. And I'm delighted to have such a fantastic panel today and looking forward to talking about ESG in relation to AI and FinTech. Almost half of the global workforce today are millennials and care a lot about ESG. We know that FinTech startups with ESG embedded in their business are more attractive to the best talent. ESG policies can also help to de-risk young companies as policy adoption becomes more difficult as they grow. Christine Tsai, CEO of 500 Startups, which is one of the most active global early stage venture capital firms, said that startups should implement ESG early on. If startups want to stand out, they should embed ESG policies into their business model, principles, and culture at the beginning, rather than trying to retrofit policies later under the pressure of investors or others. Over the last 5 years, we've seen an explosion in VC funds focusing on FinTech startups in the ESG space. So I'm really looking forward to discussing such an exciting and evolving space within financial services, and I'm pleased to introduce our speakers to you. So first up, we've got Martina McPherson. Martina, do you mind giving us a little wave so everyone can see who you are? Thank you. Martina is Senior VP of Strategic ESG Engagement at Moody's and President of the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets. Martina has held a number of leadership roles, including Managing Director of Sustainable Investment Partners and Vice President of ESG Solutions at MSCI. At MSCI, she was in fact on the research team responsible for coining the term ESG and co-authored a range of ESG and FinTech books, including the AI book, which has been released earlier this year. Next up, we have Dr. Christine Chow. She is the Global Technology Lead and Head of Asia and Global Emerging Markets at EOS of Federated Hermes. She has 24 years experience in investment management and is the member of Court and Investment Committee of the London School of Economics, a board member of the International Corporate Governance Network, and a member in the Data Governance Task Force of the UK on Artificial Intelligence. Her PhD thesis on responsible investment was shortlisted for a United Nations Award in Sweden. She was also named one of the top 30 inspirational women in the City of London and was selected as the Investment Management Leader of the Year at the Women in Finance Awards. And we have Michael Burns. Michael is a director at PwC, where he leads the AI and FinTech practice. He is an AI thought leader and FinTech veteran with 17 years of international experience. Michael has a broad background across blue chips such as Morgan Stanley and Moody's, as well as a range of smaller, innovative AI firms. This year, he has released the AI and Financial Services PwC study and AI book, to which he co-authored with Martina. We also have Sam Tiswar-Norrish. Sam is a member of the founding team of the specialist financial technology private equity firm Motive Partners. Based between New York and London, the firm has over 1.2 billion of assets under management and includes many household names. This includes Dun & Bradstreet, where Sam is the international CMO. Sam is also a founder and vice chair of the 2040, a not-for-profit that supports the development of next-gen leaders in the UK. And finally, Shan Milley. Shan works with entrepreneurs in established firms with scale-ups focused on insurance, digitalization and technology. She provides practical transformation support, growth advisory, high performance coaching and facilitation. She's a board member of Tech Nation's FinTech Delivery Panel and a board advisor for the climate action social enterprise Heal Rewilding. She's also co-editor of best-selling publications, The AI Book and The Insure Tech Book. So I'd like to kick off with some questions for Martina. Got a couple of questions actually, but would like to start by asking you about some of the key developments in ESG, AI and FinTech, and what the implications are for corporates and investors.
Thanks so much, Georgina and Emily. And maybe to kickstart the discussion, I'd like to quickly highlight the enormous potential we are seeing for artificial intelligence, so-called AI, blockchain and other fintech applications to identify, to measure and to standardize ESG, environmental, social and corporate governance, data and information, and ultimately the implications in the broader context of sustainable and / green finance. But to set the scene, here are maybe 5 key developments and drivers for ESG data and the links to AI and FinTech that I'd like to put up front for everyone's consumption. First of all, the 4th industrial revolution has already begun, and we are in the early stages of this so-called 4IR, a fusion of advances in artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, 3D printing, and multiple implications and applications where artificial intelligence is concerned. Secondly, the journey to digital transformation is at 4IR's core. And decision makers and analysts now aim to make everyday processes simpler and more efficient. That also means that trusted governance, data, and information frameworks have a key role to play. Thirdly, ESG investing is here to stay, and demand for passive factorless strategies is accelerating. So in Q3, a new milestone was reached according to Morningstar, and we saw more than $1 trillion now in sustainable investment mandates. And this is in line with the rise that has been historically assessed by the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance when and where the sheer momentum of ESG in various strategies, integration, screening, engagement is concerned. And we will highlight a couple of these efforts today as well when and where Christine will share her insights. But that means also with the rise of ESG investment, we're seeing a transition to rules-based approaches, such as passive and factor-based strategies, and they're becoming a reality and they're gaining momentum at scale. And that means that the more quantitative ESG metrics and data discussions based around these rules-based approaches is very much at the core of the development when and where we're also seeing more need for meeting a large sheer amounts of data and building relevant frameworks when and where AI and FinTech can help. And this brings me to the point, data complexity management. This is part of the journey towards systemic ESG risk and opportunities management. And we need to look at the broader context of issues and how they are being managed effectively, for instance, by companies, to get a better idea when and where and how we look at sustainability issues at scale. And that is again bringing me to my last point. AI, FinTech, and ESG have multiple implications for investors. They can provide relevant insights and align structured / unstructured data when and where financial and non-financial information is concerned. But I would also like to highlight that investors should look beyond the current sentiment and assess some of the corporate fundamentals when and how companies are managing sustainability issues and opportunities, and how they actually establish relevant policies, procedures around governance, for instance, and how they manage and measure the stakeholder impact of their activities. And again, we will dive into that a bit later on.
Thanks, Martina. And where do you see the challenges with AI-centered analysis?
Good question. Maybe we're starting talking a bit about the ethical and human rights and maybe potentially governance challenges. I know that Sean later on would talk at this at large, but maybe to highlight that AI ultimately refers to systems that are programmed to work and act like humans. And AI is developing, therefore, at speed and scale every day. It is expected that it eventually will be able to mimic and perform the same tasks that we are seeing here in our human world. But that also means that multi-stakeholder engagement initiatives have been launched, especially in the investor space, that aim to identify and assess risks and opportunities when and where human rights and human governance risks are concerned, and when and where and how they border the implications around the AI, artificial intelligence world and metrics, to actually ensure that new and emerging technologies are designed, developed and deployed and also regulated in a way that is enabling rather than threatening, for instance, human rights, including personal and political freedoms. And I should highlight that AI, for instance, when and where screening is concerned, should not be seen as a replacement of research and analytical capabilities. AI is a strategic enabler that supports but not replaces such an analytical process. And that brings me to my last quick note. Challenges remain when and where trusted ESG data and governance processes are concerned at large. And classifying, interconnecting certain issues remains a challenge, especially as there's a lack of defined ESG standards and frameworks, and terminologies are not yet clear. So ultimately, AI and FinTech can help to uncover certain hidden risks and trends, but green and social washing activities that we are still seeing and that are prevailing literally are coming also with the inherent and persisting biases of self-disclosed, annualized, and backward-looking information. And for that, AI is not the only solution.
What do you think are the remaining barriers and conundrums that remain in the ESG data domain, and how can AI and FinTech actually help to address these?
Very good question. I think we firstly need to identify and assess extra financial information and understand the context of big unstructured data, especially where the so-called intangibles are concerned. And to highlight, there's been a silent revolution in terms of what drives business valuations. Ultimately, today's global GDP is more than ever entrenched in services and knowledge, where intangible assets have become ever increasing components of corporate worth and hence valuations. And an analysis of S&P 500 companies in 2015 even came to the conclusion that in 1975, the market value of large caps was mainly linked to so-called tangible assets, and that was roughly around 83%. But in 2015, and that's roughly 5 years ago, it was now mainly linked to intangibles, around 85%. Still, what is really driving intangible value remains poorly understood. And this is when and where we're discussing extra financial information. And therefore, it's becoming now the most material aspect of a company's valuation and has obviously gained a lot of traction and momentum when and where the discussions around defining, comparing, and measuring ESG data has come and risen to the fore. And that means the last sort of other prevailing issue here is the alignment of ESG standards, frameworks, and taxonomy to create more clarity, consistency, and comparability of ESG information. And according to some of our research that we did earlier this year, currently more than 90% of S&P 500 companies are already reporting on sustainability issues in 2019. And you probably have seen KPMG recently issued a study on GRI reporting, and they came to very similar results across markets that actually sustainability reporting is on the rise. But there are still multiple biases when it comes to ESG disclosures, and that might be linked to the source. Is it the CSR? Is it the CFO office which provides information and discloses data? When and where reporting around material issues is concerned, and the type of materiality assessments that are, or lenses that are being used, from financial materiality to dual materiality, even now context-driven dynamic materiality is all at play. And ultimately, when and where the different criteria and methodologies and weighting of scores, when and where ESG information is concerned, come to play. And that is ultimately amongst and with the ESG research and rating houses, with the investors and their decision-making processes. And that leads us to this type of divergence that we are seeing, and that MIT Sloan has classified as a type of divergence when and where scope is concerned, weight is concerned, and measurement is concerned. And that's leading us to the results that we have roughly 99% of correlation amongst credit rating institutions, for instance, between Moody's and S&P, but only roughly 60% in and when amongst ESG research and rating institutions. And this is something that, of course, has brought investors to the fore of asking and demanding more information around when and how and where we can create more clarity, comparability, and consistency of information. And here again, a last note, ultimately, in order to align this information that is potentially annualized versus up-to-date and ad hoc, that is actually self-disclosed versus third-party researched. In order to align and triage this type of information, AI and FinTech applications can really help bringing relevant solutions to the fore. And this is exactly what our industry is currently exploring.
Thanks, Martina. Lots of food for thought there, and it leads on very nicely to my question for Sam, which is around the role of data in the future of ESG.
Thanks, Georgie, and thanks to BRUIN for having me today. Yeah, the role of data in the future of ESG, it underpins everything. AI is ultimately just maths, and it's maths that recognizes correlations or patterns, and fueling that maths is the data. And therefore, the cleanliness, the structure, the quality of that data is everything. And if you think about the use cases of it, ESG intelligence helps investment firms of all shapes and sizes discover and derive meaningful investment signals. And it's part of the value creation framework of all sorts of different organizations. But increasingly, sustainability analysis is becoming an important aspect in those use cases too. And if you think about it in the risk mitigation of supply chains or the analysis of privately owned assets, the key to unlocking that value really, I think, sits in the quality of that data and the coverage. And if you think about the sources of data that you have available today, you really have three types. You have the publicly available information, you have sourced data, which is improving all the time, proprietary data, alternative data, and then you have the self-assessed data, which firms like EcoVadis are helping collate all the time. And the role of that data is ultimately to help companies really understand their counterparts more intimately, to reduce risk and then to create value. And as Martina just said, whilst data is essential, it's far lacking in this sector than it is in other areas. And you can see the starkness of that contrast in the scores. ESG to credit ratings sits at, I think, 0.61 to 0.99, as Martina said. So lots of progress. I can't underestimate the criticality of data. Dun & Bradstreet, where I'm the Chief Marketing Officer, spends all of our time thinking about data. So we really are evangelists on its importance, but the tools and technology that sits on top of it, it is ultimately pointless without the right coverage and quality.
Thank you. And what do you think are the primary driving forces in the technology-enabled ESG space?
Yeah, I mean, what's not a driving force, other perhaps than Donald Trump, but unfortunately he's no more. But before we get political, I read a report earlier this year actually that said something like 70% of institutional investors expect their investing to be in line with ESG factors and standard practices in I think it was the next 5 years. And that's also reflected in other big stats that we see today. If you look at UN PRI signatories, there's over 87 trillion, not billion, $trillion managed by people who have signed up to the UNPRI. And that shows a huge amount of tailwinds in favor of this industry. So what are some of the big trends? Well, firstly, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was the Wild West. There was no standardization. And there's been a huge move towards standardization. And there's a number of different drivers for that. But regulatory changes are definitely one of those. And I can't remember the exact stat, but it's something like over the last few years, there's been over 180 different ESG regulatory measures that have been proposed globally. And that's more than the last decade combined. So it shows a huge push. And a little bit like in the public market space, regulation and asset management institutional investors are creating a lot of that downward pressure that's helping create the uptick. Same as in the public market space, finance and financial services is still a huge root source of that momentum. And sustainable finance bonds have surged enormously this year, something like 95% year on year. And green bond issuance is still a huge component of sustainability related demand. So financial services is underpinning a lot of what we see today. Another big area is consolidation in the industry. Anyone who's been reading up on this space will know about the consolidation that's driving global standards, or one global standard perhaps one day. SASB and IIRC merged, which was an enormous moment in the industry, and there's talks of CDSB, which is the carbon disclosure framework, also merging. And the catalyst for this really is the IFRS, who put out a consultation paper not so long ago on whether they should start thinking about a centralized ESG reporting entity or sustainable standards board, which ultimately is going to help us drive huge industry adoption and mandate that companies of all shapes and sizes start reporting, but specifically public companies at the moment. And then finally, technology. You know, we spend all day, every day at Motive Partners and at Dun & Bradstreet thinking about the technology that's enabling the ESG space itself. And technology is touching all parts of it. You heard Martina talk a moment ago. But if you think about things like sentiment analysis, you know, that's not an easy thing to do, and AI plays a huge role in it. Even the basic side of it through the screen scraping component requires really complex technologies, parsing technologies, ID resolution, artificial intelligence algorithms that track sub-themes and sub-themes. So I think that the advent of technology and the digitization of the world that we live in through COVID are both going to be huge driving forces for our sector.
And which geographic regions do you think are leading the charge, and how is that affecting the trends that we're seeing?
It's a great question. Well, I started with Trump. I'll end with him too. I think the EU is a fair distance ahead. I don't know if you put it in years, maybe 3 to 5 years. And it's unsurprising. The EU taxonomy for sustainable finance is mandating by 2021 that public companies, have to start revealing a whole roster of information that they otherwise weren't. And they've always been ahead in the game. I think the Biden election is an enormous win. I spoke to a good friend on the transition team just yesterday who talked about a number of key appointments upcoming, and they actually, I think just yesterday, appointed a guy called Brian Deese from BlackRock, who was head of sustainable investing there. So that shows huge intent, and someone of that caliber to be leading the National Economic Council with a focus on sustainability is just awesome. We're going to see, I think, the US catching up, and it was the arms race last century. It's going to be the ESG race this century.
Thanks. Very encouraging, we hope, for this year. But and Michael, I mean, given that you published the PwC AI study, what can you tell us about the challenges for companies implementing AI?
Yes, thank you very much, Georgina and BRUIN, for having me also. When I think back to the study that was published back in May, with about 150 experts participating. Some of the discussions that we had leading up to this event, they were kind of aligned with the challenges that we see in ESG in terms of collecting the data that is still there when implementing AI systems in terms of the availability of data. But it's also the budgets in some cases where there's not sufficient to do a full job, but also the skills and the alignment and what is really needed is lacking. And then some of the data privacy concerns in terms of some of the smaller firms implementing that, where they don't have a dedicated expert for data privacy. So some of the bigger implementations and some of the more complex things are pushed back. And what we still see in some of the firms participating is a lack of trust in the benefits. So while we heard earlier in terms of the US and the things that Sam outlined for us very nicely in terms of where the journey is going, locations like the US or then in Asia are also way ahead when it comes to the AI implementations. But that also means that from a European perspective, we have some catching up to do. It's great that in this event where we discuss the topics and combinations, we can see that at least as far as ESG is concerned, in the EU, we have a strong guideline. We know over time more and more about what data we want to collect there. So we will kind of solve some of the problems that you also see in the AI implementations from that perspective.
Great. And how can responsible AI add to the discussion about ESG?
Sure. So at PwC, we called it responsible AI. What it is really is a framework of a number of things, from the ethics and regulation and the governance around it, to also then tools and solutions to tackle bias and fairness, the explainability, as well as the robustness and the security. So ideally, it's a trickle-down effect where, based on your company strategy, you form an opinion of what solutions would be acceptable to you in terms of the ethics and the regulation and everything that is specific for your company, and then looking at the different tools and different methods available to get to a successful use case in these areas. You're using some checks to make sure that you're not introducing bias, that you have stable algorithms that will prove the test of time, that you create a secure system, all those things that can also help when thinking about creating a solid, let's say, method or system around ESG, where certainly you want robustness, certainly you want to be in line with regulation, and certainly you want some security framework, while in the background there's a lot of merging of data sets and so on going on, but you're looking to have a stable central source. We heard from Sam earlier in terms of the different sources of data, and that goes for that as well. So you have a range of options available to you when you implement AI as well as ESG. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And Christine, when people talk about bias in AI, where does that actually come from, and how do you think that we can fix it?
Yeah, before I jump into that, I'd have to apologize for arriving late. And that's partly because I was on a seminar that was talking about ESG with the CFA Institute, and there were 213,000 people signed on the platform. But we actually ended up spending half of our time. I try to, but I'm sure you don't need that. The thing is, we actually end up spending half the time talking about the importance of data and AI in ESG investing. And that's what is getting people really excited. And actually, one of the representative of a sovereign wealth fund has just basically disclosed that this is what they have been working on. So it was extremely interesting. But going back to your question on bias, I think this has been talked a lot talked about a lot, especially in recent news. You must have seen that there was news on Google about one of their staff in the AI ethics team. Well, this is public knowledge. Has left the company in whatever form or ways that she has left the company, and that's partly as being reported is to do with her frustration over some of the issues that was brought up as in bias within languages. So when we talk about biases, I think we need to get a little bit more sophisticated now that we have been talking about this for a number of years. There are biases that can be addressed. If there is a particular data gap in the data that you use to feed into training an AI algorithm and potentially testing or using a different set but comparable within the same set to test it, then this data gap could potentially be filled either by techniques like generative adversarial network, GAN, or other types of techniques. You can potentially address the data bias. However, there are biases that we cannot address as well, which is integrated into our culture and political views and even language. So a few years ago, you might have seen that Google search has come out, translation has decided to provide a masculine or feminine choice for someone who is looking for translation. It is the awareness of the fact that within languages, even something as simple as we come across, we're not even aware there could be bias. So I think when we're trying to understand what is bias in AI, we need to be much more sophisticated in understanding where it comes from. Can it be addressed? If it's something that we cannot address, how can we be more transparent to disclose that this might be an issue that we need to think about? So when we started on our journey of when we published our investor expectations, I think it was the industry first document on the responsible use of AI and data governance. That was in April 2019. We have already laid out from a legal perspective, what are the issues that we need to think about, but also from a input, output, data input, process, and output perspective, what we need to think about. So I will suggest reading up on that, and happy to answer any questions related to it.
And do you think that all AI suffers from opacity, otherwise known as black box?
It depends on how you define AI. I think this term is thrown around far too much as well. A lot of AI, we used to call it statistics and data science. And the most common form of still what we call part of AI family support vector machine that is already used in credit scoring for quite some time. So when we say that AI can suffer from opacity, it is related to a particular type of neural network or neural network approach of AI. There will be explainability issue, but it doesn't have to be black box all the time. I mean, there are partial ways of addressing this type of opacity. For example, there are a bias indicator in which you can run different scenarios through the neural network to see if you change a particular factor, how would it change the outcome? So even though we cannot specifically explain what the neural network is doing, we can vary the different inputs in order to be able to understand where the variability could come from. So I do not believe in black box, and from the investor and shareholder representative perspective, you should never accept that if something is a black box, then you can't ask further questions. This is not acceptable.
Thanks, Christine. Very interesting. And Sean, just wondering, in your opinion, what you think an ESG authentic corporate really looks like?
Sorry, I was so busy listening there that I forgot to unmute myself, Georgina, in preparation. So again, like everybody else, thank you so much for having me. And just a few brief words around, I think what you've got today is and I'm honoured and humbled again to be in the company of such brilliant sector experts as Michael, Martina and Christine and Sam, who are only just getting to meet. And I think, I suppose, where I come from is thinking about the perspective of the business, of the corporate, albeit my focus is on insurance and financial services, those types of corporates, and thinking about the people at board and in teams and on the front line who I think need to be sufficiently educated and informed and aware that they too can play a role in making decisions and contributing to how their corporation's cultures evolve, and B, what does customer first and customer centric look like in the digital age and in the age that we're in at the moment. So in other words, you know, it shouldn't be left to compliance, it shouldn't be left to the chief investment officer, it shouldn't be left to silos in an organization, although as we can see, you know, experts definitely have a massive role, right? There are things they need to do as part of their jobs. So my focus always is thinking, well, how do we take all of this wonderful expertise, including the poignant questions to ask, as well as the what learning do I need to do to be able to participate, have agency in my own role in an insurance firm or a financial services firm, and thinking at how complicated it is, and particularly for people at board as well, actually, because they are at root human beings, right? And they may well be technically expert in certain areas, but they're not expert in everything. No one can be in the 2020s. And actually, just as a sidebar, I don't think humans have got used to that yet. I don't think we thoroughly really believe that if there's no amount of work and no amount of research you can do that will enable you to know everything that's material. And that's a massive change in human history, to my mind, just as a sidebar. And I think it has big psychological impacts, actually, on how we think about everything. So to go to your question, so the easy answer for me is slightly trite, but I don't mean it to be trite, Georgina, is an ESG authentic corporate has to do three things. And it touches on stuff that all of our speakers have talked about up to this point. You've got to have a clear answer to your own, or a clear question yourself as a corporate. Why are you? What are you doing? And as Michael was talking about, you know, that purpose directly impacts on making informed choices about the technologies you are going to embed and the business models you're going to support and build your business on as a result. And I think it's a massive challenge for all corporates, but particularly for financial services firms, and particularly in relation to AI. Because as we've heard, you know, building it, deploying it, embedding it in supply chains, investing in it as institutional investors, which financial services, as we've heard, is pushing that whole agenda ahead. That's where the money is. It touches so many different areas, right? So the carbon cost of FinTech, the social cost of FinTech, you know, increasingly, it's not at all clear what the social benefits and impacts of FinTech on customer actually are. Whereas on conversely, we're now starting to get a lot of commentary and data that's painting the picture of the downsides really quite compellingly. That's stuff we have to grapple with. The business models at the heart of the platform economy, which is also known as surveillance capitalism. These are big reputational issues that play to Martina's intangibles in firm valuation. Governance, huge issues here. Big tech, responsible AI. So that clarity on your own purpose and what that means to you, I think, is the first thing. The second thing is measuring, obviously, where you are and where you want to get to. Now, I was kind of keeping a little bit of account, but I was listening very hard to the conversation as well. So I'm not quite as stato as that, but there are at least 5 or 6 different taxonomies that have been mentioned so far, along with, well, actually, which data do you believe? Because actually the correlation, which to my layperson's ears is how many of the ESG ratings suppliers actually agree with each other. Well, it's just over half at 60%. The rest, 40%, is not in any kind of agreement at all. It's hard to know, isn't it, which measurements you should go for. Now, in corporate world, we're seeing the SDGs, the Science-Based Target Initiative, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Those 3, at least, seem to be increasingly standard, sort of fundamental baseline, really, for the larger firms anyway. But the important point is measuring where you are, choose your taxonomies, and then find out where you are, and then disclosure. Now, here it gets interesting, because I'm still hearing, I still think that corporates and the corporate world kind of still thinks that it's up to them, up to us, to decide what we disclose and when we disclose it. So I think in the insurance world, of a particular example, something called ClimateWise, which is a closed group of insurers who basically disclose to each other, but in an anonymous way, their emissions data, their impacts in that way. And they've been doing that for, I don't know, 12, 14 years. So quite, well before this current bandwagon has started. But no one else gets to see it, really, not really. The fact that they meet, we know that. The fact that they rank each other, we know that. We know certain things, but not the stuff that would really make the kind of difference, arguably, to really understanding where those firms really see themselves and the trajectory that they're on. So my view is that for a whole combination of reasons, which I could talk about forever, but I'm not going to, don't worry, Georgina, is that I think control over that disclosure story is rapidly leaving the corporate frameworks. I think civic activists like Insure Our Future, formerly known as Unfriend Coal, so that gives you a clue where they're focused, and organisations like the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, they are gathering the data, they are telling the compelling stories that are truly making it clear where these corporates, from their perspective at least, where these corporates stand. So ESG authentic, to me, in a nutshell, is say what you mean, do what you say, embrace accountability, transparency, responsibility, and explainability. Same words that you'll hear being talked about, AI and responsible AI, of course. Just don't try and get away with it, Georgina, because I just don't think there's that latitude is shrinking very rapidly. And I think it would, from an intangible valuation point of view, I think it's a much smarter strategy to be on the right side of history, to my mind.
And in your opinion, is AI a force for ESG authenticity, or is it a blocker?
Well, I think our experts have explained in a variety of ways how AI technologies and the use of it, obviously, as humans, the volume and velocity of data that we're faced with, if we really, really do want to do all the wonderful things that our experts have described from their own fields, we need help, right? And we need tech help. So yes, it could be, is the first answer to that. But equally, it's a massive force for failing and getting a really bad rating from people like Vigio Iris, part of Martina's Moody's family, because there are some very, very, very serious downsides to AI technologies, not least the carbon cost, not least the social cost. So to me, it'll be I think it's really exciting in a way, but also very interesting and compelling that the people who are creating the metrics and the measurements and the analysis, so Martina and Christine and others, to me, they potentially have the biggest power, along with very forward-looking administrations like the EU, actually. They have the power to shape how companies effectively understand their valuations and act accordingly in their own business interests. But we need those ratings, we need those structures and standards and guidelines to both explain, but also to hold accountable.
And how much is FinTech and InsurTech actually contributing to enabling firms to realise their ESG aspirations?
So it's a mixed picture, isn't it? Right. So there are some really, really good examples, I think, of emerging firms and scaling firms who've set out to be of help and also to set out to do things differently. So those two aspects, really, helping, being capability vendors, if you like, helping corporates to get a better grip on their own governance, for example. So if we look at the environmental side of that equation of ESG, so really, I was very pleased to be able to point out the Lloyds Banking Group in their internal innovation program called Launch, which is just coming to a next point in its stage. I'm slightly involved in that. They set the target for the businesses coming into that cohort as half for ESG. So the bank's own ESG challenges, they wanted to have half of that new cohort come in specifically to help the bank tackle those challenges. And coming out of that cohort, some really interesting businesses, My Carbon Manager, which is for consumers and employees to manage their own carbon, understand and then make choices around their own carbon footprint, for example. Climate resilience, so Provisico or a flood forecasting startup. And then outside of that cohort, just to balance things up a moment, take a look at Fuji, an interesting business that's a consumer-facing proposition, again, for greening up investments. On the social side, you know, I have a real issue with this as a fan of insurance and also for FinTech and InsurTech as a force for good. However, there is absolutely no evidence of the social positive impact of FinTech and insurance in terms of financial inclusion. There isn't any, actually. And on the other side of things, Georgina, there's a lot of evidence, which I was sort of slightly alluded to in the beginning, that suggests quite a lot of harm actually coming out of that. So, but there are some nice examples too. So take a look at Invest AI, which is supporting financially vulnerable customers, and Signly, which is basically translates financial materials into sign language for the deaf, which enables deaf customers to actually understand the reams of website pages that they came out of the Microsoft's AI for Good accelerator. So there are some really good examples on that social side. And then governance, aligning capital to values. Where you're putting your money basically tells you where your values are, which is what we're talking about today, right? Now, there's a really interesting business called Ethics Grade that its whole point is to help firms with governance at scale and at velocity. So some great examples, but not enough, I would contend.
Thanks, Shan. And I think we're now actually going to move over to Emily as we're going to open up questions to the audience. Just as a quick reminder to the audience, if you can just put your questions on the Q&A function rather than the chat function, that would be great. But over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Georgie. So first one come through for Sam. Sam, how can we bring the next generation of tech-savvy leaders into the conversation about ESG?
It's a great question. I think it's a responsibility that's bestowed on everyone, and it's not just the responsibility of the corporates. The next generation is immeasurably more conscious than I think perhaps the previous generation about this sort of thing. And it's been led by pioneers like Greta Thunberg, who've dedicated their lives to sustainability and all the different components associated with it. But I think we need to give the next generation the tools to learn. ESG is still an acronym that wouldn't be understood by people in schools, I don't think. That's a bit of a speculation, but I suspect not. And I think we need to build it into the curriculum in some respect, whether that's in schools or in corporates. Now, I have a pretty strong opinion about the inadequacy of education, both in schools and in corporates, and it not being well-rounded enough. But with a huge focus on next generation leadership and learning outside of the corporate four walls, sustainability is definitely going to be one of those topics. So I guess a long-winded, not very articulate way of saying there's not going to be one right model for helping enable the next generation. We've got to think horizontally and vertically on this stuff.
Yeah.
May I challenge that? Actually, about the younger generation, and my son put me in my place when I challenged him, when I asked him, do you know what is Sustainable Development SDG? He said, of course I do. I even know what is Millennium Development Goals. Do I need to tell you? And that was a few years ago. And when he told me about what he did in geography, he said he was working out what are the factors that affect the different development pathways for India compared to other markets. So I don't think we should underestimate what we say the younger generation could do. In fact, I think the younger generations are much more impressive than those who are in power.
Entirely with you.
Yeah.
I also want my son to spend more time with your son.
Sounds good, and I think we should always. I think that the title of this discussion is the age of authenticity, or part of it is. So I think, first of all, when we think about technology in the 21st century that we're living in, we should really just judge or value people as who they are, but what they appear to be. Because somebody looks young, because someone looks female, because someone, might look LGBTQ, might look different. It doesn't mean anything anymore. To me, it just means, okay, what are you bringing to the table? What is your viewpoint? What are your backing up? What are the information that's back up your arguments? What's the quality of the argument? I think that is the most important part. Whether we call it ESG or not ESG, actually, maybe I want to make a prediction here. Within 10 years' time, ESG is going to disappear because everything is going to become part of that. So let's see what happens.
Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. Let's hope. Sorry, Sam, could I just quickly just say to Christine, I think you're absolutely right. But in order to have that judgment about quality of argument and to have that conversation, there's a level of working knowledge that we all have to have. And it's actually quite difficult to achieve at the moment. So I think that curriculum idea, starting really where it matters, is a really good one. But also, I think, the openness. So all the people I've met so far, particularly on this call, have been really open to me as a person who's not an ESG expert, who's not even a data expert. I'm not even a technologist. I'm an accidental techie who happens to think that in order for business people to make sane decisions and change their corporations and their culture for the better, they need to understand. And the more complicated it is, the more important it is for people to have a working understanding so they can make their own decisions. And I just think that what we need to be able to do collectively as change makers is to try and make it possible to knock down those barriers of, oh my God, this is so complicated. This is so technical. What place do I, as a layperson, have in this conversation, let alone being part of deciding what happens next? And this has been the technocracy that's surrounded, and it's actually endemic to our culture, but it's certainly surrounded the development of AI. When you have people actually saying you shouldn't be running a business unless you're a technologist, I just want to give up and go home, because creating new barriers and new silos isn't going to get us where we need to be as a species, but also as businesses. So let's knock down the silos. Let's make it possible for people to have conversations with each other. And I'm very heartened by civic activists and also coders, like the Algorithmic Justice League, famously, Joy Boylan-Winnie is saying, if on the debates around facial recognition, the strapline there is, if you've got a face, you've got a place. And I think that's the spirit that we should be aiming for, to get this stuff discussed and agency and informed decisions being made, regardless of what you look like, who you are, and whether or not you have a, quote, right to be sat at that table.
There's a certain theme here, I think, around the definitions, right? When you think about AI itself and what a person on the street would understand and what the reality is in terms of machine learning. But this kind of using language that can be interpreted in different ways, that we also have that in corporate finance, for example, where you create these different understandings, sometimes to keep people out of the full understanding. And listening to you, I feel we get to somewhat the same in ESG, where the terminology is not aligned yet. There's no common understanding yet, and people could actually mean different things when they talk about a certain rating. I'm just observing. I find it quite interesting that we talk about 3 different areas, and yet there's a common theme around the fluffiness of the terms used.
Well, can I just give one little example there, Michael, of language being used in a way to meet an agenda? So the analysis of, let's say, insurance companies that have adopted AI, whatever that means, right? And you and I could talk about that for a long time, I know. So in certain analyses, you'll have language that says insurance firms are laggards. Okay, that is a pejorative term. That's a loaded term that basically says they're going slower than they really ought to be. In other analyses, you will have actually adoption of machine learning models is following a thoughtful approach. That's a completely different way of looking at it, and suggests that there's a care, there's a caution, there's a process being approached there. And I just feel that so much of the language is aimed at selling stuff, actually, which means that we get pejorative language attached to people actually just wanting to make the right decision and wanting to have the right information in order to do that. Language matters, doesn't it? So much.
Thank you. Right, so next one for Martina. Where have you seen organizations in APAC leading the way with FinTech solutions?
Thank you, Emily. I mean, maybe up front to quickly discuss again the three broad areas for possible applications of FinTech and AI in the areas of sustainable finance. So blockchain applications up and foremost in the FinTech context have, for instance, been used for applications for sustainable development, for use cases for renewable energy and decentralized electricity markets, for carbon credits. I think this came up a bit earlier, and carbon markets and carbon pricing in the context of carbon markets, an ever growing debate. Again, I've just come off a debate in Hong Kong with Carbon Care Asia this morning, where I've heard a lot around these developments. And then, of course, climate finance. And lastly, the third area, innovation financial instruments, especially sustainable bonds. And some of the platforms we've been seeing that are up and foremost now leading in this space is something that the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, for instance, developed, where they're trying to harness FinTech solutions for insights, collaboration, and education in sustainable finance. So this new stage platform aims to promote visibility. We highlighted this multiple times as well, transparency, again, coming up here in the age of authenticity, and accessibility of sustainable and green finance information across asset classes and product types. And these type of developments really will help investors on the one hand to access comprehensive databases for sustainable finance and investment options, as well as provide access to Hong Kong's securities markets. And I mentioned it will provide valuable education and advocacy platforms, promoting knowledge sharing and stakeholder engagement around green finance, or sustainable finance, I should say. And it ultimately will become something which probably other jurisdictions will learn from. I heard there are similar developments here in the EU, to become a repository of information on sustainability. That's obviously data, as we highlighted, that's information around green and social bonds and ESG related exchange traded products, such as ETPs/ETFs that are literally listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange as well. And this type of development is something that other jurisdictions can take note of. There are other jurisdictions which already list green bonds, such as the LSE Group / London Stock Exchange here in London, and ultimately Stockholm and other markets following suit. And lastly, beyond actually the innovation in the market by large-scale exchanges and trading platforms, there's also entrepreneurial spirit here. I just wanted to highlight that Moody's is exploring implications for AI and analytical ESG tools in the market, especially in APAC. And we just had made in a minority stake in Meotech, and that's a provider of alternative data and analytical tools for ESG and know your customer markets in Greater China. And it will literally help to provide intelligence through AI technology to track and scan alternative data sources related to ESG, related to KYC, and ultimately to provide transparency and accessibility to information around supply chains, financial information, and ultimately capture something like 800K public and private companies in China, in a market where, again, I'm sure Christine will come in as well on this, transparency and accessibility to information remains a prerequisite, but also a challenge. And this is something for me, when and where and how we utilize FinTech, on the one hand, as I highlighted in the context of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and or AI, to actually get access to these large-scale data sources, big unstructured pieces of information in multiple languages, as Christine had highlighted. There's a question and a challenge how you translate these connotations around language and meaning, but there's also the other area, how and where can you get access to the sources of information, and can build the tools for the future that can align and structure, again, different type of inputs and triage information, as also Sam had highlighted, in order to bring them together and create meaningful data points.
Very interesting. That thanks for sharing, Martina. And actually last Saturday, that was when Ping An Insurance, the only globally systematically important insurer from China, the only one from China, has the inauguration of the AI ESG platform. So they are popping up everywhere. But I think actually, besides the analytics, I think that companies themselves individually would need to start building their own data schema, their own data mechanism in which they're lacking. And hence, I think it was just yesterday that Satya Nadella from Microsoft has just announced a new service from the company to help every single company in the world, if they want to build their own, make sense of their data. So I think we're at the very, very early stage of this transformation. I mean, the technique has been around for some time, continues to improve, but the application of it, we are at the very, very early stage of explosion almost. So exciting time. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just conscious of the time, Georgia. I know we've got questions coming through, but I think we're probably going to need to wrap up if we want to stick to time. So I'll hand back to you. Thank you very much to all of the panelists.
Great, thanks Emily. And I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I've learned a lot about the opportunities and challenges associated with AI and FinTech. It seems that in the main, AI is still quite poorly understood and creates as many myths and fears as it does hopes and aspirations. Some people fear that machines are going to take over the world, whilst others believe that it can help to create jobs and build a more sustainable future. It's clear that investment managers are coming under increasing pressure to measure ESG criteria in their portfolios, and that effective ESG has never been more crucial in such a rapidly changing world. However, it is being hindered by difficulties surrounding the effective collection of ESG data, as well as a lack of standardization when it comes to reporting. The issue for investors is how to know which firms are good ESG performers and which are not. The majority of information comes from companies reporting their own data, and with little regulation, this can lead to unhelpful data gaps and greenwashing. Artificial intelligence can help to prevent exploitation or greenwashing and can enable asset managers to build green funds by screening companies for ESG more effectively. It allows investors to collect and analyze large mountains of data and more information than ever before. AI has proven to successfully extract data from sources such as news articles and board transcripts, which would be very labor intensive for analysts to do manually. There are also AI themes that can improve healthcare or help farmers to increase productivity while reducing water consumption, or even that can be used to screen out technologies and products used to create weapons of mass destruction. So it seems AI does have the ability to have a dramatic positive impact on ESG investing and the future state of the world. However, it's clear that AI is not without its faults. There are concerns that it might reduce the number of mid-tier jobs and algorithms that could replicate existing problems in society if the data set that teaches these programs is biased to start with. AI also takes enormous amounts of computing power and energy, and we're going to hit a brick wall unless we can get AI's energy consumption right. But although there are difficulties surrounding AI, it seems that it still enables human beings to make more intelligent decisions, and so surely it is worth having in the investment process. It has the potential to revolutionize responsible investing and to reallocate resources towards firms that will create a more sustainable future. Thank you all for attending, and a great thanks to our fantastic speakers who have contributed today. I'm delighted that all of our ESG webinars are now available to watch on our website, and due to the success of our ESG series, we've created podcasts off the back of these webinars, which we'll be emailing through shortly. We hope this ESG series has given you a broad view of ESG across financial services, and that it will give you the tools to empower you to bring ESG further up the corporate agenda. Thank you.